International donors pledged an estimated $4.4 billion in humanitarian aid for Syria and neighbors sheltering its refugees in 2018. The amount pledged at a conference in Brussels Wednesday falls short of the more than $7 billion the United Nations is seeking. Meanwhile, a UN official for humanitarian affairs told the UN Security Council in New York the escalation of attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in Syria is creating a new humanitarian crisis. VOA's Zlatica Hoke reports.
The war in Syria has entered its 8th year and there is no end in sight. Civilians are increasingly the victims.
Attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure have reached some of the highest levels since the conflict began. In the first 3 months of this year, the United Nations has verified 72 attacks on health facilities. This compares to 112 attacks in all of 2017.
Ursula Mueller, a UN humanitarian affairs official, called on the Council member states to do more for the protection of Syrian civilians.
Civilians must be provided protection with constant care taken to spare them and the infrastructure they rely on. Attacks on hospitals in particular must end. The wounded and the sick must be afforded the treatment and care they need.
The brutality of recent attacks on civilians has created new waves of displaced people, adding to the refugee crisis. An aid donor conference in Brussels Wednesday failed to secure the amount of $7 billion requested by the United Nations for this year in humanitarian aid for Syria and neighboring countries sheltering its refugees. Germany and Britain were praised for making generous pledges.
A number of important donors have not yet been in a position to confirm their financing for 2018 because of the status of their internal budgetary discussions, and that includes the United States, which has been providing something more than $1 billion a year in humanitarian assistance to Syria and the region over recent years.
The United Nations says more than 13 million Syrians are in need of humanitarian assistance. More than 5 million refugees are displaced outside the country. An estimated 450,000 people have been killed in fighting, sparked by the March 2011 crackdown on protesters against the government of President Bashar al-Assad.